The air over central Germany, in the second week of April 1945, was thick with the smell of pine forests and coal smoke, a scent now laced with the acrid tang of cordite. It was the smell of a collapsing world. For the reporters embedded with the forward elements of the American Third Army, men like Edward R. Murrow, the advance had become a grim inventory of destruction. But nothing could prepare them for what they found just outside the small town of Ohrdruf. This was not a prisoner of war camp. It was something else, a subcamp of a place they had only heard of in whispers. Buchenwald. General Dwight D. Eisenhower had insisted they see it. "We are told that the American soldier does not know what he is fighting for," he had stated, his voice tight with a cold fury. "Now, at least, he will know what he is fighting against." The reporters walked through the gates on April 12th, the day President Roosevelt died, though most of them wouldn't learn of it for hours. The sensory shock was immediate and total. First, the smell, a cloying, sweet-and-sour odor of unwashed bodies, dysentery and death that clung to the back of the throat. Then the sights, the skeletal figures in striped rags who stared with hollow eyes, the stacks of emaciated corpses piled like firewood, the gallows, the whipping blocks, the crematorium with its doors still agape. This was a concentration camp, a place of extermination. It was a truth so profound and vile that it immediately recalibrated the nature of the war in the minds of those who witnessed it. But it also raised a deeply unsettling question that had been circulating for months. For years, the German propaganda machine, under the meticulous direction of Joseph Goebbels, had broadcast a very different image to the world. They presented a Germany that, despite the rigors of total war, was a fastidious and correct custodian of its prisoners, especially the captured soldiers of the Western Allies. Citing adherence to the 1929 Geneva Convention, Nazi spokesmen and state-controlled media painted a picture of well-ordered camps where British and American prisoners of war received adequate food, medical care, and mail from home. They released photographs of captured airmen playing soccer, of officers staging theatrical productions, of enlisted men receiving their weekly Red Cross parcels. This narrative was a cornerstone of their claim to legitimacy, a stark contrast to the barbarism they attributed to the Soviets. Now, standing amidst the horrors of Ohrdruf, and soon Buchenwald and Dachau, the Allied world was confronted with the Reich's true capacity for industrialized cruelty. If this was the reality for political prisoners and Jews, what had been the true fate of the more than 300,000 American, British, and Commonwealth soldiers held in the camps designated Stammlager and Oflag? The official story was about to be measured against the grim accounting of liberation, revealing a complex story not of a single monstrous policy, but of a system's gradual, then catastrophic, collapse into the very barbarism it claimed to oppose. The framework governing the treatment of prisoners of war was, on paper, unambiguous. The Geneva Convention of 1929, ratified by Germany, Great Britain, and the United States, established clear international law. It stipulated that prisoners must be humanely treated, protected from violence, and provided with lodging, food, and clothing equivalent to that of the detaining power's own depot troops. Officers were not to be compelled to work. Enlisted men could be, but not in industries directly related to the war effort. Critically, the convention guaranteed prisoners the right to receive correspondence and relief parcels, and it established the right of neutral parties, primarily the International Committee of the Red Cross, to inspect the camps. From the outset of the war in 1939, Germany established a sprawling network of camps to house the growing population of captured Allied soldiers. The system was meticulously organized by the Wehrmacht. Officers were sent to Offizierslager * or Oflags. Enlisted men went to Stammlager * or Stalags. A crucial distinction soon emerged. Air Force personnel, captured by the * Luftwaffe, were generally sent to camps under its direct control, the * Stalag Luft system. This separation would prove to be a matter of life and death. In the early years of the war, from the fall of France in 1940 through 1943, the system largely functioned within a recognizable, if strained, interpretation of the rules. For an Allied airman shot down over occupied Europe and sent to a camp like Stalag Luft III near Sagan, deep in Silesia, life was a monotonous, grinding ordeal defined by boredom, hunger, and the constant, low-grade stress of captivity. Yet it was a structured existence. The German ration, consisting of watery soup, a few potatoes, and a daily portion of dense black bread often bulked up with sawdust, provided a bare subsistence of perhaps 1,500 to 1,900 calories. What made survival not just possible, but tolerable was the arrival of the Red Cross parcels. Packed in Britain, Canada, or America, these 11-pound boxes were a lifeline. Each contained treasures of nutrition and morale: tinned corned beef, powdered milk like the famous Klim brand, dense biscuits, cheese, jam, chocolate, and cigarettes. The cigarettes became the camp currency, used to trade for extra food, information, or materials for escape. The German authorities, for the most part, allowed these parcels through. The logic was cold and pragmatic. Well-fed prisoners were less desperate and easier to manage, and the principle of reciprocity, the knowledge that hundreds of thousands of German soldiers were in Allied hands, served as a powerful check on official behavior. The Red Cross made its inspections, and while camp commandants were adept at staging a clean barracks or a decent meal for the inspectors' benefit, the basic infrastructure of the convention held. This carefully maintained facade of correctness was essential for German propaganda. The Nazi state invested significant resources in documenting the good treatment of its Western captives. Propaganda companies of the Wehrmacht produced films and photo spreads for magazines like Asterisk Signal, showing healthy-looking British and American men engaged in leisure activities. One film, Kriegsgefangene in Deutschland, POWs in Germany, depicted prisoners playing musical instruments, tending gardens, and lining up for ample meals. These images were distributed internationally through neutral countries, intended to reassure the world of Germany's civilized conduct and to counter any Allied reports of mistreatment. The message was clear: Germany was a nation of laws, fighting a hard but honorable war. This narrative was deliberately selective, ignoring the catastrophic death rates, well over 2 million, among Soviet prisoners of war, who were explicitly denied the protections of the convention and treated with a genocidal neglect that saw them starved, worked to death, and executed en masse. For the Western Allies, however, the German posture of compliance, backed by the shaky but still functioning Red Cross system, created a baseline of expectation. But it was a baseline built on a fragile foundation, one that could not withstand the pressures of a failing war machine and an increasingly radicalized regime. The first major crack in that foundation appeared not in the kitchens or the barracks, but deep underground in the sandy soil of Silesia. On the night of March 24, 1944, the tenuous gentleman's agreement that governed life at Stalag Luft III was shattered. For over a year, under the noses of their German captors, Allied airmen had engineered one of the most audacious prison breaks in modern history. 3 tunnels, codenamed Tom, Dick, and Harry, had been excavated with staggering ingenuity, using bed boards to shore up the sandy earth and converted milk tins for digging tools. That night, 76 men crawled through the completed Harry, a tunnel 336 feet long and 30 feet deep, and emerged into the freezing pine forest beyond the camp's wire. The escape was a triumph of Allied organization and spirit, but the German reaction marked a seismic shift in the treatment of Western POWs. When the breakout was discovered, the camp was sealed, and a massive nationwide manhunt was launched involving the Gestapo, the SS, and civilian police. Within 2 weeks, 73 of the 76 escapees had been recaptured. 3 made it to freedom. For the rest, the rules of the Geneva Convention were about to be rendered meaningless. An enraged Adolf Hitler personally ordered that more than half of the captured men be executed as a deterrent. This was a direct violation of international law, which treated escape as a disciplinary offense, not a capital crime. The order, which became known as the Sagan-Befehl, Sagan Order, was handed down from the head of the SS, Heinrich Himmler, to General Arthur Neeb of the Kriminalpolizei. In late March and early April, 50 of the recaptured airmen, including Britons, Canadians, Poles, Australians, and South Africans, were taken from civilian and military jails in small groups. Driven to secluded locations, they were murdered by Gestapo agents, their deaths officially recorded as shot while trying to escape or died of acute circulatory collapse. This act, the Great Escape Murders, sent a shockwave through the Allied POW community. It was a clear signal that the Wehrmacht's authority over prisoners could be summarily overridden by the Nazi Party's security apparatus. The line between a prisoner of war and a political enemy of the state had been violently blurred. The Schutzstaffel, or SS, was now a direct player in the fate of Allied captives, and its methods were not bound by treaty. The murders were a turning point, demonstrating that the Führer's ideological fury could now outweigh the pragmatic concerns of reciprocity. While the systematic day-to-day administration of the camps remained, for the moment, in the hands of the German military, the incident created a new atmosphere of fear. Prisoners understood that the protection afforded by their uniforms and the Geneva Convention was no longer absolute. Simultaneously, the strategic situation was shifting. By the summer of 1944, the Allied invasion of Normandy had opened the Western Front, and the Soviet Red Army was relentlessly pushing westward from the east. The Third Reich was caught in a vice. This new phase of the war would place an unbearable strain on the German state, and the POW camp system, with its hundreds of thousands of captives, would be one of the first internal structures to buckle and then break under the pressure. The carefully curated images of well-fed prisoners playing chess were about to be replaced by a far more desperate reality. The human experience inside the wire was a universe away from the propaganda reels. It was a world distilled to its essentials: food, mail, and hope. A captured American B-17 crewman, after weeks of interrogation and transit, finally arriving at a permanent camp, would have found his existence immediately governed by these three elements. Food was the central obsession. The German ration was a constant topic of conversation and complaint. It was a meager, monotonous diet calculated for bare survival. Breakfast was a mug of ersatz coffee, a foul-tasting brew made from roasted barley or acorns. Lunch was the main meal of the day, a thin soup, usually made from turnips, cabbage, or potatoes, occasionally with a fleck of horsemeat. The evening meal was often just a slice of the dark, dense bread known as *Kriegsbrot*, sometimes with a sliver of margarine or a spoonful of fishy-tasting jam. The daily caloric intake often fell below 1,500 calories, a starvation diet for active young men. One prisoner later recalled the gnawing, ever-present hunger, a feeling that emptied your mind of everything but the thought of the next meal. Without supplementation, this diet inevitably led to malnutrition, weight loss, and diseases like scurvy and beriberi. This is why the Red Cross parcel was not a luxury. It was the foundation of the prisoners' economy and their health. The arrival of a parcel shipment transformed the mood of a barracks from despair to jubilation. The contents were savored, traded, and combined in elaborate recipes cooked on small makeshift stoves. A tin of Spam could be fried, a portion of powdered milk could be made into a pudding, a precious square of chocolate could be eaten with ritualistic slowness. The prisoners organized themselves, pooling their resources to ensure fair distribution and to care for the sick. Cigarettes, which came in most parcels, became the universal currency, the fag economy. A pack of Lucky Strikes could buy a German guard's silence, a loaf of bread, or the parts for a clandestine radio. Mail from home was the other pillar of survival. Letters, though heavily censored and often delayed for months, were a vital link to a world outside the wire, a reminder of family, love, and a future beyond captivity. A single letter could be read and reread dozens of times, its phrases memorized, its news shared. The absence of mail was a profound psychological blow, feeding the sense of isolation and abandonment. These small human-scale details, the taste of real coffee from a Red Cross tin, the sight of a wife's handwriting on a V-mail form, were the psychological armor that prisoners wore against the dehumanizing daily grind of camp life. But by the autumn of 1944, this fragile ecosystem of survival was beginning to collapse. The success of the D-Day landings in June 1944 and the subsequent Allied breakout from Normandy created a crisis for the German POW system. As Allied armies raced across France, the number of captured German soldiers soared, but so too did the number of captured Americans, Britons, and Canadians. The system, already strained, was now inundated. Then came the disastrous Allied airborne assault, Operation Market Garden, in September, which yielded nearly 7,000 new prisoners. The breaking point arrived in the winter of 1944-1945. The German counteroffensive in the Ardennes, known as the Battle of the Bulge, began on December 16, 1944. In the chaotic opening days of the battle, several American divisions were encircled and overrun. In the span of just a few weeks, the Wehrmacht took more than 23,000 new American prisoners, the largest single capture of U.S. troops in the European theater. This sudden influx of tens of thousands of men overwhelmed the German capacity to house, feed, and transport them. The new prisoners were herded into temporary enclosures and then packed into railway boxcars, often 60 or 70 men to a car designed for 40, for journeys that could last for days. With no food, no water, and no sanitation, the conditions were appalling. Allied air superiority, ironically, made their situation worse, as fighter bombers strafed the unmarked German trains, killing and wounding hundreds of the POWs locked inside. The camps they arrived at, such as Stalag IXB at Bad Orb or Stalag XIIA at Limburg, were horrifically overcrowded. Barracks built for 200 men now held 500. Food rations, already meager, were slashed. The Red Cross parcel system, disrupted by the Allied bombing of German rail lines, began to fail. Deliveries that had once been weekly became monthly and then stopped altogether in many camps. With the parcel lifeline cut, prisoners were thrown back entirely on the German ration, which by now had dwindled to less than 1,000 calories a day. Disease became rampant. Dysentery, pneumonia, diphtheria, and typhus, spread by lice, swept through the packed, unhygienic barracks. The camp infirmaries, lacking medicine and staff, were little more than places to die. The disciplined, orderly world of 1943 had devolved into a desperate struggle for survival, a reality utterly divorced from the still-operating German propaganda that claimed all was well. Even as their POW system was collapsing under the weight of numbers and the destruction of the German infrastructure, the Nazi propaganda ministry continued its campaign of denial and counter-accusation. Goebbels's apparatus adeptly used the principle of reciprocity as both a shield and a sword. They would publicize the visits of the International Red Cross to model camps like Oflag VAIB at Eichstätt, ensuring inspectors saw only freshly cleaned barracks and prisoners who had been given a decent meal for the first time in weeks. The resulting neutral reports, while often cautiously worded, could be spun by German media as proof of their humane treatment. Simultaneously, they launched a concerted effort to portray the Allies as the true violators of international law. The Allied strategic bombing campaign was depicted as a barbaric war against civilians. German newsreels showed dramatic footage of bombed-out cities, accusing the Royal Air Force and the U.S. 8th Air Force of terror bombing. This narrative extended to the treatment of German prisoners. The Nazi press seized on any report, true or rumored, of mistreatment in Allied POW camps. They highlighted the poor conditions in some camps in the United States, where German prisoners were occasionally housed in tents in harsh weather, or the use of German POWs for dangerous labor, like clearing minefields in France after the liberation. The most potent propaganda, however, was directed at the alliance between the Western powers and the Soviet Union. German propaganda constantly warned its own people and the world that a victory for the Allies meant a victory for Judeo-Bolshevism. They contrasted their correct treatment of Western POWs with the horrific and largely true stories of the fate of German soldiers in Soviet captivity. This served a dual purpose. It shored up domestic morale by painting the enemy as monstrous, and it sowed discord among the Allies by suggesting that Britain and America were complicit in Stalin's brutality. The complication for Allied leaders was that some German claims contained a kernel of truth, making it difficult to issue a blanket denial. The reality on the ground was that conditions for German prisoners varied widely. While most camps in the US and UK were run correctly, the logistical chaos in newly liberated France led to genuine shortages and hardship for German captives there. This complex picture allowed German propaganda to obscure the truth, that the breakdown in their own POW system was not a matter of isolated incidents, but a systemic, top-to-bottom failure driven by their own collapsing state. By January 1945, the military situation for Germany was hopeless. The Red Army had launched its massive Vistula-Oder offensive, chewing through the German lines in Poland and advancing on the borders of the Reich itself. From the west, the Anglo-American armies, having recovered from the Battle of the Bulge, were pushing towards the Rhine. Faced with the prospect of his vast network of POW camps being overrun by the Soviets, SS Chief Heinrich Himmler issued a catastrophic order. The camps in the east were to be evacuated. The prisoners were to be marched westward, deeper into what remained of Germany. What followed became known to the survivors as the Death Marches. Throughout the brutal winter of 1945, tens of thousands of American, British, and other Allied prisoners were forced out of their camps in Poland and eastern Germany and driven west on foot. The marches were conducted with lethal incompetence and cruelty. The men were already weakened by months of malnutrition, and now they were forced to walk for hundreds of miles in sub-zero temperatures, through snow and freezing rain, with inadequate clothing and footwear. The march from Stalag Luft IV at Gross Tyczów in Pomerania was one of the most notorious. On February 6, 1945, some 6,000 Allied airmen were forced out of the camp with little warning. They marched for nearly 3 months, covering over 500 miles. Their guards, often a mix of regular Wehrmacht, aggressive Hitler Youth, and brutal naval troops, offered them almost no food. The prisoners survived by begging or stealing potatoes and turnips from frozen fields along the way. They slept in open fields or crowded into barns. Stragglers who could not keep up were shot, bayoneted, or simply left to freeze to death by the side of the road. Dysentery and frostbite were rampant. Men traded their watches and rings for a single loaf of bread. The marches were a moving tableau of human misery, a final, desperate act of a dying regime determined to hold on to its human captives as bargaining chips or potential hostages. The death toll was staggering. It is estimated that at least 3,500 Allied prisoners of war died on these forced marches in the first 5 months of 1945. The German system, which had begun the war with a pretense of adhering to the Geneva Convention, was ending it by reprising the very methods of the Death March, a tool of genocidal cruelty the SS had perfected in the East. As Allied armored columns punched deeper into the heart of Germany in April 1945, they began to encounter the ragged survivors of the marches. Soldiers of the U.S. 11th Armored Division, pushing toward the Austrian border, were shocked to find groups of emaciated men in remnants of American uniforms staggering along the roads. They liberated the notorious Bürger and Deir Elster camp, a subcamp of Buchenwald where 350 captured American GIs had been forced into slave labor, digging tunnels for an underground factory. They found that 77 of the Americans had already died from starvation, disease, and abuse at the hands of their SS guards. On April 29, the U.S. 14th Armored Division fought its way into the town of Moosburg and liberated Stalag VIIA, the largest POW camp in Germany. In a sprawling complex designed for 10,000 men, they found over 110,000 prisoners from every Allied nation, including thousands of Americans and Britons who had endured the winter marches. The scenes at liberation were a mixture of jubilation and horror. The prisoners were euphoric, but their physical condition was appalling. Medical surveys conducted in the days after liberation revealed the full extent of the system's collapse. The average prisoner had lost between 40 and 60 pounds. Men who had been captured weighing 180 pounds now weighed barely 100. Their bodies were racked with the diseases of malnutrition, edema, which caused their limbs to swell grotesquely, skin lesions from vitamin deficiencies, and chronic digestive ailments. The liberators immediately set up emergency aid stations, flying in tons of food, medicine, and clothing. But even this process was fraught with danger. The prisoners' starved bodies could not handle rich food, and many who ate too much too quickly died of refeeding syndrome. Medical teams worked around the clock to combat outbreaks of typhus, delousing thousands of men with newly developed DDT powder. The numbers told a story of criminal neglect. The death rate in the final months had skyrocketed. At Stalag XIB at Fallingbostel, British forces found 3,000 prisoners so ill they could not stand. over 1,500 had died during the preceding winter. The carefully constructed propaganda narrative of Germany as a humane captor lay in ruins, exposed by the undeniable evidence of tens of thousands of walking skeletons. The reporters and photographers who followed the troops now had the final, damning proof. The story they would send home would not be one of military correctness, but of a state-sanctioned descent into barbarism that, in its final throes, had ceased to make any distinction between its various categories of victims. The story that finally reached the American and British public in the spring of 1945 was not the one crafted by Goebbels, but the one written on the bodies of the liberated prisoners. It was told through the unflinching lens of Asterisk Life magazine photographer Margaret Burke-White, who captured the gaunt faces and skeletal frames of the survivors at Buchenwald and Erla. It was broadcast in the measured, horrified tones of CBS correspondent Edward R. Murrow, whose report from Buchenwald on April 15, 1945, became an iconic moment in journalism. "I pray you to believe me," he told his American audience, his voice heavy with the burden of what he had witnessed. "For most of it I have no words. If I've offended you by this rather mild account of Buchenwald, I'm not in the least sorry." Murrow was describing a concentration camp, but the conditions he documented, the systematic starvation, the disease, the casual brutality, were echoed in the reports emerging from the liberated POW camps. The distinction had eroded to the vanishing point. The evidence proved that the Third Reich's adherence to international law was never a matter of principle, but one of pure convenience. As long as the German state was stable and the prospect of retaliation was real, the system for Western POWs functioned. When the state began to disintegrate in mid-1944, and as Nazi ideology supplanted military pragmatism, the veneer of civilization was stripped away. The material reality of a nation losing a total war, collapsing supply lines, destroyed infrastructure, and a paranoid, vindictive leadership, inevitably translated into starvation, neglect, and murder for those in its power. The story of the Allied POWs in Germany is the ultimate proof that a nation's treatment of its captives is a direct measure of its own stability and foundational character. In the end, the reporters did not need to uncover a secret policy of abuse. They simply had to walk into the camps and document the inexorable, logical outcome of a totalitarian system consuming itself from within.